Good afternoon and salutations, my webinar goers. This is another fabulous edition of the Michael McCumber CannaHub Cannabis Tech Audit webinar series. We are joined by three amazing panelists who are going to take you on a journey through standard operating practices in the cannabis space. With that, David, please lead us on.
Yes. The fun doesn't stop when you get onto these webinars. It just begins. Let me tell you. Um, so, you know, we've done enough of these to realize that the funnest conversations are the ones that you just have, not necessarily plan out. But this is one of those conversations which you can kind of do both. I think all of us, if we've been in cannabis, understand the challenge, especially if you've been in other industries and then you come into cannabis, you understand, wow, the back office definitely is its own kind of beast. How do you define it? What is really the back office? And why is there always this like problem where you can't do the basics on that back office business front? And what we're exploring here is, as a cannabis company, you're organically developing and growing. Sometimes you don't have access to some of the usual tools and resources that other companies do, and so you start just working, putting it together, and as a result, then you end up having those transactional pieces of the back office begin kind of spreading. They start spreading through the industry, and now suddenly you're trying to figure out, okay, wait, how are these decisions made that allow everything to flow through to a back office in an organized manner so they can be transacted against. And what we're exploring today is, what's the solution around that and where do you start? We are not going to be saying, just keep hiring. You've already tried that. We're not just going to be saying, throw even more technology at it. I know this is a tech webinar, but we're going to actually be talking about more of the organizational and the approach to it as we go through this. So the best spot, I think, is Dom. I think this is kicking off. Let's define what is actually going on here.
Yeah, this is one, David, where despite, cannabis and all of the interesting nuances of cannabis and the personalized strategies and compliance in his market, back office, the best way of thinking about it is just the work that gets processed. And outside of cannabis and inside cannabis, we thankfully have some, kind of core functions that we really think about. So when we talk about back office work, what we're really talking about within there is things like finance and accounting. So, most notably, accounts payable and accounts receivables, orders, the transaction. Compliance. When we think about back office, compliance pops up, and compliance is a critical component, as we all know. Things like transfer manifests have to go out with packages. IT, right? A lot of companies that are both cannabis and non-cannabis will have IT personnel and or service providers, and then operations. I think operations, and I'd be remiss not to mention HR as well, because HR is a very critical component when it comes to onboarding a lot of the tech and the talent that we have in those. What I think is interesting about cannabis, in most non-cannabis companies, they will end up creating these, actual organizational structures where IT sits under one hood, finance and accounting. In most cases in cannabis, and, as we see the industry growing, a lot of these functions actually being outsourced, or in a lot of cases distributed across other functions. So, accounts receivable may end up in a sales function because we want our salespeople to collect on invoices. And so I think it's really important, as we kind of start today, as we're thinking about it, there's the work that gets built up with the categories of work, whether it's a technology, compliance, or a finance and accounting function.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the back office isn't just the people that are sitting in these in IT or in HR or in accounting. In the cannabis business, it's really everyone that is creating transactions that ultimately become the basis of operational and financial reporting. So if, for example, accounting is spending an enormous amount of time correcting inventory at the end of the month, reconciling transactions and cleaning data, the first question isn't necessarily like, how do we make accounting faster? The question should be, what happened upstream that accounting is now responsible for fixing? And it's that perspective that we really want to kind of focus on throughout this entire webinar today. So oftentimes what we see in this world in cannabis, in the back office and in all of these bottlenecks that we start seeing coming forward, is that what people have done is they've grown organically, right? So they start out with an idea, they decide to buy a license, they get together funding, all of the things that you have to do to actually launch. We love entrepreneurs because their strength is they go to action. But what the outcome of that oftentimes can be is that we create processes to meet the needs today, and then we preserve those processes as though somehow the processes were the goal, rather than the processes were being used to get to the goal. And so instead of learning how a system intends to solve the problem, or how tools out there are intended to solve the problem, we take our solution and try to create it inside of a software. And the result is bottlenecks.
Yeah, it's funny, Rach. I mean, I think even as you started there, talking about the cause of the work being upstream or downstream, and particularly in cannabis, where we have so many entrepreneurs, and as businesses start to grow, right? Look, that work still gets done, right? So whether or not you're a single store, one person, and you added a couple other people to the workflow, the manifest has to get out, the orders have to get placed, the AR has to be collected. And more often than not, like a process will develop, and at some point, let's say I'm the owner of a company, I don't want to be doing invoices all the time. But what I do is I just kind of put down my recipe and say, hey, I'm going to hire somebody whose hourly, is maybe less than mine. I'm going to have them just continue to repeat that process.
Yeah.
And as the business scales, that work never really gets thought about. And so we just know that, hey, this is the way that we've always done it. This is how we've got orders out the door. Or maybe we go get an outsourced provider, and at best, they show up for a few hours a week and really just follow the steps in the process that we've given them, without really understanding, hey, how do we streamline this? How do we, if we're going to add personnel here, how do we actually make this more efficient?
Yeah. What we've seen so many times are companies who have gone down that exact path you're describing there. And those roles that they have are so specialized, become so specialized, non-traditional, that one is very hard to hire. So that ends up being a rather difficult solution. That's why you just can't throw more people at it. And every single one of the solutions that you put in place actually move each of those disconnects at that back office point further and further. And I love Josh's image here. That conveyor belt on the left is going to put everything on the floor. That is what's about to happen there. And somebody at the bottom has been hired to bring it back up and try to also line it up on the conveyor belt at the bottom. And it's a perfect outcome of what we are, like, depiction of what we see. And I think so what's the cost of this kind of approach to solutioning your back office?
Yeah, I think that technology applications is something that we see this demonstrated really, really clearly. And it's kind of easy because I think everybody has had this experience. You get a software that is to solve a specific pain point. So for example, you get an order management software that is supposed to help you break up your orders from one customer across all the different licenses that they have that it needs to be shipped to. Because of course, in metric, your manifest has to be by license and all of those kinds of pieces. And what is not seen is that the way that software gets information from, say, metric, is going to cause a problem with the inventory quantities in there. So your operational software is creating your packages a certain kind of way, and then this software is scraping metric to grab the packages and have it ready for inventory. And so what ends up happening is those discrepancies start causing there to be more sellable product than actually is physically available to be sold. As a result of that scraping integration issue, now the inventory is not actually accurate, which means you can't use the storefront that is supposed to be one of the key functions of that order management software. And the pain for the company moves from the need to have a storefront where customers can place orders and a need for those orders to be spread across licenses easily, to a need to keep inventory accurate in the system. And so what we see has now been created is the company is paying somebody to manually create the inventory in that order management software, even though it was supposed to be able to automate it, and then is putting the orders in themselves because they can't use it as a storefront. So they're actually manually keying in the orders. Then they're actually downloading the orders out of that software to put into their fulfillment software where the inventory is actually being picked, packed, and shipped. So now you've actually just created like 3 more jobs for a software that was supposed to do it. So it starts to be that we create this kind of like patching on solutions on top of each other to deal with bottlenecks, rather than taking that holistic approach to try to figure out what is causing the bottlenecks. And as all that happens is the bottleneck just gets moved to either upstream or downstream, depending on what solution you're looking at.
Yeah. It's funny, right? So again, as we go through, it's like it's the same volume of work. It's just the, distribution, what personnel, what function you put it in. And, like it's never really like the end user's fault or the person that's doing the actual function themselves, right? They've inherited a recipe, right? They got on board by HR, they talked to their operations counterpart, and they were given a recipe for how to do this thing. And if we have a simple recipe, and that's that recipe is able with one person to support 1,000 orders a month. Well, what happens when I jump into 2,000 orders? Does that mean that my same recipe can just be duplicated with one person? Well, why am I still doing the same recipe in that next state, right? And in a lot of cases, we see tools like Metric, right? Tools like Metric where this is really compounded, where maybe you don't have a full ERP, manufacturing piece of technology. What we see a ton of times is operators using things like metric tags or additional spreadsheets and export out of metrics, ways of capturing the actual work in certain stages. And it's great, right? Because what they're trying to do is starting to like categorize and capture the information in that state and time, which is the first step into getting a process map of like how to root cause the efficiency. But in a lot of cases, by doing that, again, Rach, to your point, I've created a new job for somebody else, or I've added a new step in this process where maybe it's a 25-cent package tag or a 10-cent package tag. Well, it's fine, but if I'm doing 5,000 plants or harvest 5,000 tags at 10 cents, and I now have to continue to do this, all of a sudden that work that's just getting redistributed across the team just starts to pile up into that last, image you were showing there, Dave. Eventually just all into one fold.
And redistributed in many cases in a way that doesn't lend itself, like getting people to reproduce orders and then they put it in wrong. I mean, again, like you said, don't blame the users. In fact, they're not being set up for success. In fact, for some of them, it's really laudable what they've done. We see some of the most intensive, like, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to learn tech I never knew. We're going to bring on people. We've seen some very elegant technology put together to be able to fix these problems. We've also seen, like, if you're watching this, then you probably have already participated in one of those patch it. Can't do this. Let's move to the next. We move to the next. And what are we doing? We're patching it again. And it's following us around. And so there's definitely a way to move away from this kind of experience and habit and solutions that clearly just don't work.
And so now this is the point at which Rachel gets to talk about SOP, which is always Rachel's favorite thing to talk about. One of the things I think is really fascinating, SOP sign. One of the things that I think is really fascinating about learning about how businesses grow and about technology and the interaction of business and technology is that I keep coming back to the idea of transactional cycles. I didn't even know what this word meant when I started this work, but transactional cycles out in the like general world are what is used in accounting and in auditing. And it's things like order to cash, procure to pay, hire to retire, record to report, revenue cycles, etc. And those types of cycles are what ERP functionality is built on because, of course, we quantify business in terms of dollars. So if I create my SOPs, what I find that actually happens in cannabis frequently right now is that the SOP is actually a set of work instructions, and it is the work instructions that are based on the process that was the patch that was developed over time. And so the work instructions say, I'm going to do this thing and fill in this field and then push this button. But if you actually create SOPs that are based on transaction cycles, for example, order to cash, then how do we source a customer? How do we onboard them? How do we create an order? How often can an order be updated before we have to do a cutoff for fulfillment? How does fulfillment happen to make sure they can pick and pack that order? How does the invoicing occur? What happens when we have a rejection? I mean, a lot of people say we don't do returns, but rejections are a regular everyday occurrence inside of cannabis. And then how do we collect? So this is an entire complete business process. When you write your SOPs on these transaction cycles, then what happens is you cross all of the different departments and you involve everyone, and all of a sudden all of your roles start to define themselves as well. So maybe at the beginning, the person who creates the sales order is also the same person who creates the invoice after fulfillment is done, because it's a small enough operation. But when you're looking at this, order to cash as a transaction cycle, and you start to get big, the natural break is that one person creates the sales orders and another person creates the AR invoices. That's a very natural break. And so then you are able to not only define your roles in a way that technology will help support as you can take on, more sophisticated technology, or you have a larger tech budget, et cetera, but it also helps you in your hiring to know what skill sets the person needs to have for a role, what specific qualifications they might need for a role, and to be able to have a transactional structure that allows you then to understand if we replace software in one part of this structure. So if we replace our financial software, or we replace our order management software, et cetera, what does that do to the rest of the process? So you're looking at it holistically. You're not building in silos. Everybody is contributing. You understand your roles, and you also understand what the implications are of a change.
Yeah. Oh, SOPs.
Always.
Yeah. It's funny, right? Because as we get into like these tech focused webinars, right? Like there's a consistent theme around the both digital and the physical world, right? So like the SOP as the of the physical world can blend both digital elements of it.
Yep.
I'll give maybe an example, right, of like the product creation. I think what I'm getting at here is the basics of understanding that SOP or the process, and item creation. In a first question, it is how many items am I creating every week? And most applications, whether it's Metric, LeafLink, Dutchie, have the ability for you to understand, hey, the volume of items getting created every week. What I would think about as the that ritual, David, is great. Who's doing the work? Does that same data set give me the ability to understand what personnel in my company is actually creating that item in my technology, right? Can I marry it back to the SOP, as Rachel's talked about, that says, hey, this is the right person, just, and then take that a step past. What information did they use to create the product name? Did they get it from a source like Metric? Did they get it from a digital asset management? Once they go through there, is there a check with compliance? So they have to create THC and expiration date in the listing so that consumers have it. And then as they do that, where does that go next? So does it push out to my e-com? Does it end up on an invoice? Does it end up on a shipment? And if I'm starting to do that, right, if I'm creating this ritual or this habit where I can track that every week, I can start to identify, hey, did I create 40 items a week in last year? Am I creating 60 items a week this year? Does that mean I'm creating, and who's creating them? Has it increased? Have I added a new layer to this? But it's almost like that toothpaste, right? If I'm starting to smooth out the process and quantifying each one of these steps in the process, I can actually put a personnel, a role, a responsibility. I can quantify how many they do. How many invoices is accounting creating every month? And by doing that, again, I can ask where the information came from, how is it used, where is it downstream, and start to quantify where the work is happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're also then able, oh, sorry, go, Dave.
Well, I was
You're
just going to
also
say,
able
the key there is that documentation of SOP, please remember this. It is not just a due diligence step. What Rachel said was super key there. It actually causes all of the departments to have to weigh in on the realities of what they actually do. That documentation serves as a pulling together of departments that otherwise really wouldn't necessarily think to share that information because they don't know the implications of it. And to your point, Dom, as you go through and record those, one of the things that pop up might for one department be scale that for the other department just seems like a record transactional flow. And when you start saying, hey, it's 60 weeks, we see someone who's like, it was 6,000 this month, and we just had this big influx of something. And you just have to really think through what are those different requirements and pieces as you go.
Yeah, and there's a balance here that we're trying to strike. We're not suggesting that every cannabis operator be at the level of like a large corporation. We're not suggesting that you copy every Six Sigma process and try to recreate it or something like that. Companies grow organically for good reasons. The opportunity here is to ask what standard solutions and knowledge already exist that we could access and that would give us structure to help us understand how a business can mature. And this gives you this framework that gives you functionality for today, flexibility for the future, and a pathway forward to that future. So instead of people ending up in situations where they don't get the information in time, their bottleneck is created, etc., we actually can make sure that everybody's getting what they need just in time, and that as the business scales, we understand what the cost of change is going to be for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, best practice, man. Again, when we started on this journey today, right, we really said that, like, hey, the back office is a work item that exists in every company. And, I know, Rach, you touched on, maybe a process like Six Sigma, which is just a business process improvement, best practices. There's tools that are kind of within there, simple things like process flow mapping, right? Again, we kind of touched on with creating an item, right? Ask your team, right? When I was in previous roles at a large tech company in cannabis, would offer customers to come on site and walk through from seed to sale where product went in cultivation and metric, and then who touched it and where did they move it to and how long did it stay there for. And so again, a lot of the cannabis tech vendors have a ton of appetite to come on site and to learn your process. So if you don't have a process map, maybe ask one of your vendors or your IT source or who are the experts in your business that you can responsibly rely on. But by going through this process of starting to map down, hey, how many SKUs are in my product catalog? How often am I creating a new item? How many orders am I pushing out amounts? How many deliveries? Pick one process. Pick one process, right? So you can order to cash, Google order to cash tomorrow, and go through and apply that back to how do I place an order and how do I collect the cash? Who all touches it? And just think about things like, where do I create a customer? What are my, but really get down, the process flow is getting down to understanding the root cause. Where does the work build up? Is it, I have a tool like Elite where my sales reps are entering 500 orders a month. Why am I not asking myself, how do I take 10% of that and shift it over to my buyers placing an order?
Yeah, exactly. So if you take one bottleneck that you're dealing with today, so you do that mapping like you were talking about, and then you take one bottleneck that you're dealing with today, and you don't start by asking what software will solve it. Instead, you identify the complete transaction cycle that bottleneck belongs to. Hopefully, you were able to do that when you did the mapping. And then you look at your roles and your systems and you see what actually aligns with the cycle. Your goal here is to make sure that solving the task does not create another bottleneck somewhere else in that cycle. There's an understanding that when the cycle is going from beginning to end, it might not be the cycle of everything you do in business, but it's the cycle of one of the roles or one of the streams in business. And so by having already mapped it to the correct cycle and then mapping each action to each step in that cycle and your roles, then today, without another software, without another hire, you can already start to understand what is causing your bottlenecks, how solving them might push the bottleneck just somewhere else, and then starts to open up the possibilities of what solutions are available to you.
I couldn't say it better, Rach. I mean, yeah, as a data professional, sending the reports out is, kind of something that's just come along with the role, and learned a long time ago, understand where the request is coming from. What does the personnel really need from their request? And when I send this thing off, who's going to receive it? and what are they going to do with it? And as we're mapping out these processes, it's a pretty similar structure of understanding what do they do with it after. And if you haven't asked that, maybe it's time to. And if there's an opportunity of shifting around information from ahead of upstream to downstream, again, by identifying one process and bottleneck and releasing it, right? We're only as fast as the slowest part of operation. So identifying that or removing that, time is money, gives us speed back. And despite saying I didn't have any there, Rachel, I think I added another 2 minutes of content for you.
I'm glad.
I think I think what this slide and this process here that we just talked through really highlight is that why in the background. And I think that's something I want to just underscore. When you reach out to that vendor and you're looking, okay, so what are those steps? What are those roles? How is this supposed to flow? When you're mapping those processes between your different departments, what you're really doing is you're accumulating very specific for your department. Why for us is it this way? This is your piece. Nobody else is going to really step in to do this for you. That's why if you buy the next software, your problem kind of follows you around. But this is it takes a lot of diligence. And at the very beginning, it feels more like, homework than really something that's going to align our business, change our lives. What we've found is it absolutely does. This is a definite slow down to speed up kind of moment. So yeah, I really appreciate this focus, this organizational focus. I think it's a very practical way to address a pain point that, in this webinar we've kind of touched on many times, but yeah.
Absolutely.
So Josh, what's happening on the 16th?
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much again for tuning in this week to speak with our three panelists. Coming up on the 16th, we have another exciting entrant into the Cannabis Tech Audit webinar series. It is titled, You Cannot Cost What You Do Not Trust. The focus on this one is on symptoms of bad data, why teams stop trusting their systems, and practical steps to restore accuracy and alignment. So as it says on the screen, scan the code, join us on the 16th at the same time where we will dive into that subject. Thank you all again for joining and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks all.